Thank you. Thank you, Millie. A lot coming up, and also beginning this summer, I'll begin a series of presentations in various locations on the centennial of the Scopes trial, the trial of the century. And so this will be a retrospective on the Scopes trial and its significance. One of the truly most significant events in American Christian history over the last 100 years. So I'm very much looking forward to that. And so we'll fill you in on the details a little closer to the time. All right, well, good being with you. And yes, please. Yeah, good being with you. And so we have just 2 more sessions and an awful lot to cover. Thanks. And so if you're following along there in your study guide, we're going to begin on page 29, Lewis in Midlife. And I can't cover all this material to any extent, so I'll try to, just emphasize certain points. But anything else that's of interest to you, of course, please don't hesitate to bring that up. Let's see, we have a couple of comments here in the chat session. I think you are on mute. Well, I think, okay, I think we've unmuted. And so I think we're good to go here. All right. So good to see those of you joining us online as well. All right, so C.S. Lewis in midlife, and midlife for him, well, that's the late 40s and 50s and so on. As you know, he'll die in what year? 1963. On what date? November 22nd. If I remember correctly, some other semi-famous person died on November 22nd, 1963 as well. Okay. Pardon me? Conspiracy theorists are out there. Oh, so that's just a conspiracy that Kennedy was assassinated. Okay. Yeah, Aldous Huxley also. And Peter Kraft, who's a great Christian apologist, he's Roman Catholic, and he wrote a book years ago talking about, it's kind of a mythical account of C.S. Lewis, John F. Kennedy, and Aldous Huxley meeting in the waiting room of the afterlife, okay, before they've been assigned to their ultimate destinies, okay? And it's a fascinating account because when you think about it, those 3 individuals represent 3 drastically different worldviews. And for C.S. Lewis, obviously, he's a Christian theist. For John F. Kennedy, even though he was a nominal Catholic, he was essentially a secular humanist. And then Aldous Huxley is more attuned with Eastern spirituality and so on. So it's a fascinating book, and they're discussing, what awaits them in the afterlife. So if that's of interest to you, you might look it up. It's a very entertaining book to read. It's only, I don't know, 120 pages or something like that. That's Peter Kraft, Kreeft. And oh dear, offhand, I can't recall the title, but it would be pretty obvious if you look it up on Amazon. All right, so C.S. Lewis in midlife. All right, so after World War II, Oxford University, its undergraduate population really swelled, of course, all these people coming back from service in the military. And so Lewis is going to find himself busier than ever with all of his tutorials and all of his teaching responsibilities and so on. Now, he's teaching in the School of English Language and Literature. And so his classes are among the most popular on campus there at Oxford University. And for the most part, at least, he's very much admired by a lot of his students and some of his colleagues, but certainly not all of his colleagues, though there's a lot of professional jealousy involved, obviously, as there would be in any, university faculty. One of his biographers, A.N. Wilson, and when A.N. Wilson wrote this biography of C.S. Lewis, Wilson was not a Christian, and in fact, he could be quite critical of Lewis and all. But Wilson concludes his biography by saying C.S. Lewis was a great man. You felt you were in the presence of someone who made his contemporaries seem like pygmies. And that's, from all I've learned over the years about Lewis and these elite English universities, I'd say that's an understatement, okay? That he made his contemporaries seem like pygmies. Despite all of his fame and his brilliance, he's very controversial among his Oxford colleagues. And he's passed up repeatedly for faculty promotions. Throughout his tenure there, he remains a lecturer and a tutor. He never really achieved the rank of full professor. Now, later he will when he leaves Oxford and goes to Cambridge University. He's very much accepted there at Cambridge. But Lewis, of course, is very, very controversial. And many of these Oxford dons, these faculty elite, find his books on Christianity to be embarrassing. Why would an intellectual in the first place be a Christian and then writing, what are tantamount to evangelistic books on Christianity and encouraging other people to seriously consider the claims of Christ and even, submit their lives to Christ and all. So that's not acceptable at a place like Oxford University. Again, A.N. Wilson, his biographer, writes that Oxford was a strange place. And Dons, senior faculty, are strange people. I could attest to that. He says, brilliance in a colleague is quite as likely to excite their envy as their esteem. And so, our fundamental problem in life, as we all know, is not all this corruption and evil in the world. It's in here, it's our egos. And that's certainly highlighted in that comment by A.N. Wilson. Yes, Bruce?
Just again, from color commentary, Stephen Meyer, who was one of the top writers in the intelligent design world, three of the most famous folks there. He was a student at Oxford, and he was a history of philosophy and science. So he went to a philosophy lecture, and there was a guy talking about Kant, and he mentioned something about Kant's work that Meyer wasn't familiar with. So he asked a question, since I'm very interested in what you were talking about, could you give me a site so I could find read more about that? They were a little nervous. And as they walked out, his advisor came up to him and put his arm around his shoulder and said, Maya, I know you Americans think there's no such thing as a stupid question, but we don't do that here. Don't ever ask a question which exposes your own ignorance. Sorry.
Okay.
So when he talks about invite envy and stuff,
It's one person's ignorant opinion. Yes. All right. Now, the late 40s here after World War II is also a time when the Inklings, that elite group of friends of C.S. Lewis, along with J.R.R. Tolkien and others, they begin to sort of, that group begins to kind of wither and people begin to drop off and everything as well. Now, a small group continued to meet more or less regularly, both during the war years and after the war years at a pub that's right across from Oxford University. It's called the Eagle and the Child. You can go there today, or at least until fairly recently, you could. Millie is saying she thinks they have closed, and I think that's correct, and that's very disappointing. We've been there several times, and it's always a priority to go to the Eagle and Child pub, and that's where Lewis and Tolkien and the other quote Inklings would gather. Okay. But anyway, their, I don't know, halcyon days, their glory days were pretty much over. You know, a lot of these members of the Inklings were getting well into middle age, and they had families now and increased responsibilities. And then over time, though, see, a lot of this kind of rough and tumble verbal jousting that these people relished. C.S. Lewis certainly did, and others as well. Um, a lot of people's egos had been bruised over the years. And so some of them had pretty much had it with going and all this, as I said, verbal jousting that would go on when these, you know, elites would get together and critique one another's works and sometimes critique one another's lives and so on. So one by one, people start dropping out. But for several years, a highlight of those meetings was J.R.R. Tolkien reading from his work in progress, The Lord of the Rings. And in fact, Lewis was the one who was really encouraging Tolkien to continue working on that project and you know, don't give up, don't get tired of the project. Lewis thought it had tremendous amount of value. And so later, Tolkien later admitted that without Lewis's encouragement, it's very doubtful that he would ever have finished writing The Lord of the Rings. And once he finally did finish that, the Inklings then kind of gradually dissolved. And in fact, they ceased to meet altogether in late 1949. So a new phase in Lewis's life and Tolkien's life and so on. And again, they had relished that time together. But again, people are getting older and they have different priorities and so on. So it's apparently many of them felt like it's time to move on and focus more on their families, whatever. Now, the Inklings dissolve, but Lewis continues his involvement in the Oxford Socratic Club. Great name for an intellectual gathering, the Socratic Club, named after the real progenitor of Western philosophy. I mentioned Peter Kraft a while ago. He also is a great Socratic scholar and has written several books, including one, again, it's kind of a fanciful dialogue on how Socrates becomes a Christian. And he just follows Socrates' philosophy and all to its logical conclusion. And it's, again, just a really entertaining book. So beginning a few years earlier, Lewis had presided over this weekly forum, the Socratic Club, and that primarily featured topical debates between a Christian and a skeptic. And due mostly to Lewis's influence, the Socratic Club becomes one of the most popular clubs on Oxford University's campus. And typically somebody would read a paper that would then be critiqued by an opponent who held an opposing view. And then Lewis would weigh in on the subject before opening it up for general discussion. So very intellectually stimulating. And again, a lot of egos were bruised, I'm sure, along the way. But Lewis really takes great delight in these kind of verbal battles. You know, if you set aside your ego, you can enjoy this sort of these sorts of exchanges, even if they are critiquing you and your writings and all. But it's you know, our ego, that's the main issue, main problem. But anyway, as one of Lewis's biographers, George Sayer, puts it, most of the people there had come to hear Lewis address the opposition with logic, with his quick wit, and his great gift for repartee. Is that the pronounced repartee? And a rarity in academia. Lewis combined intellectual brilliance, common sense, oh my, and sound moral judgment which is usually not allowed in most academic settings, of course. For example, Lewis, as I've said before, was nearly alone on the Oxford campus back in those days in seeing communism and fascism as twin terrors, mirror images of each other, and equally evil. Okay. A lot of these Oxford elites, of course, were hardcore socialists, and they would even cut tyrants like Joseph Stalin, give him a lot of leeway and so on. Anyway, as a result, and in a reversal of fortunes in the old Lions versus Christians scenario, C.S. Lewis would kind of moderate these debates and discussions, and he would regularly, in George Sayers' words, he would regularly maul his opponents. And so he doesn't pull any punches when it comes to exposing ignorance and faulty assumptions and that sort of thing. Another biographer puts it this way: no one who witnessed these debates has ever suggested that Lewis played fair. He argued with tremendous vigor, and when he demolished his victims, he did it with evident relish, because he's exposing lies and nonsense and so on. There were those who admired Lewis's courage, moral courage, in testifying for the Christian faith, but not everybody found the spectacle altogether edifying. Okay. So, of course, when we are defending our faith, we need to do so in the spirit of Christ. We need to speak the truth in love. And it's not about, again, a battle of egos and trying to overpower, anybody. And so we need to be very much aware of our own limitations and our own inherent egoism. And whenever a discussion or a debate becomes a battle between a Christian ego and a non-Christian ego, the Christian always forfeits the high moral ground. So, remember that. So anyway, Christianity in Oxford and some of these other universities had been under assault, of course, for not just decades, but generations. England at that time, along with the rest of Europe, is quite far along the road to secularism than, for instance, the United States. But at this time in history, the United States is desperately trying to catch up, of course. But our Christian influences are still more prevalent back then than in Europe in general and Great Britain in particular. So there's an unwritten code of conduct demanded that one keep his religious beliefs private at a place like Oxford. And until Lewis began publishing and speaking publicly about his faith, Christians virtually never spoke up openly on the campus about their faith. Now, a lot of them would go to church, a lot of them were nominal Christians and all, but what really sets him apart from virtually all the others, all of his colleagues, is that he actually sees himself as a bit of a Christian evangelist, not just an intellectual, but an evangelist. One of his biographers, George Sayers, says that skepticism, tolerance, and even indifference were commonly thought to be the proper attitude toward Christianity. So, if you're an intelligent being, then how could you possibly accept, the Bible and what it says about especially the life of Christ? It was commonly thought that a man's belief is a private affair and should not be written about or published. It was thought unsociable and a breach of convention for faculty members to attack others for their beliefs, or worse still, to try to convert them. Okay. Ironically, even Christian friends like J.R.R. Tolkien, for instance, disapproved of Lewis's openly evangelistic works. Now, in addition, many of his colleagues resented his commentaries on issues outside of his area of professional expertise. For instance, when Lewis commented on theology, well, he's not a professional theologian. What's he doing speaking, on theology? He has no right to do so. He doesn't have a PhD in theology. Likewise, when he would share his thoughts on morality, philosophy, social issues, and so on, oftentimes he'd come under a lot of criticism from colleagues. But his critics aside, he was a beacon of light, and he was in what otherwise was a very spiritually dark, institution. As one former Socratic Club member remarked, quote, "If I have an adult Christian faith that's a rational faith, I owe it to the meetings of the Socratic Club. I never realized before I went there that Christianity could be defended logically and rationally, and that most of the arguments used by its opponents could be shown to be irrational and absurd." So Lewis really has a unique calling in this regard, and to his great credit, he generally follows through with that, even though he's risking friendships and so on. And in fact, the anti-Christian bigotry, and that's all it is bigotry that he experienced there at Oxford, was a major factor that prompted him to write the third volume in his Space Trilogy, That Hideous Strength. So anyway, it's a stimulating environment, but he has to remain very, very strong because it's a hostile environment. So any thoughts on that before we move on? Anything? Pardon me?
You're right, Mere Christianity. When was that? Oxford?
Mere Christianity actually was a series of radio broadcasts.
Oh, that is.
Yeah, beginning 1941, 42, and then eventually in 1952, it was collected into the book Mere Christianity. Anything else?
Just wondering why it was so shocking to talk about your faith. I guess because in proper English society, there's certain topics that just, you don't want to make someone uncomfortable, maybe.
Yes, that must have been a factor, but also keep in mind the residual effects of the Reformation. Now, we hold the Protestant Reformation in very high esteem, as frankly we should, because it was absolutely necessary. Well, it also absolutely generated an enormous amount of hatred and violence and, these horrific, quote, religious wars between Catholics and Protestants and so on. And oftentimes in those conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, there were other Christians like the Anabaptists who were caught in the middle. Now, the Anabaptists were generally pacifists, and so they were slaughtered by both Catholics and Protestants. And so consider that and the effects of that over the centuries. And so there's a lot of cynicism when it comes to Christianity in general, because of all the violence associated with the Reformation era. Yeah. Sad because we again rightly hold people like Luther and Calvin and others in high esteem for their courage in confronting the Roman Catholic establishment of their day, but also there was the associated violence and hatred and discrimination associated with all that as well. For instance, when the Protestants would get in control of a particular area, they would persecute the Catholics, just as they had been persecuted for centuries. Yeah. Yes.
I think I recall that at one point during a 20-year period, England went from Catholic to Protestant, Catholic to Protestant.
Yes.
Wow.
So
Yes.
Four changes in 20 years.
Yeah.
It just creates
That
incomprehensible level of discrimination.
yeah,
You know,
very violent period. That's during the reign of Henry VIII. And then his successor is his son, Edward. And Edward's a Protestant also. But then Edward dies at a very young age, and he's succeeded by the next in line, and that's Mary Tudor. And we know her, rightly so, as Bloody Mary, and horrible atrocities carried out against Protestants. So she's Catholic. And then, truly by God's grace, she didn't last long. She's only on the throne 3 or 4 or 5 years, and she's succeeded by her sister, Elizabeth, her stepsister Elizabeth, who's again Protestant. Yeah, so you can imagine all the violence, hatred, bitterness, and rivalries and everything going on at the time. Yeah, it really is. It's and think of how it the effects it has on the reputation and, in some people's minds, the credibility of Christianity when all that stuff's going on as well. So thankfully, here in America, we didn't have anything similar to that, at least not on that level at all. All right, well, if you see there on the next page, the lost debate at the bottom of page 30, I'm not going to dwell on this, but the point here is that in 1948, one of Lewis's Oxford Club debates turned out not to be as Lewis had expected it to be. See, up to this point, he had pretty much reigned supreme as the undefeated heavyweight debater of the world, or at least the undefeated heavyweight debater at Oxford. And but in 1948, he goes up against a professional philosopher there at Oxford by the name of Elizabeth Anscombe. And the unimaginable basically happens, and that is she wins the debate. Now, the subject of the debate is basically this. It's chapter 3 in Lewis's recently published book, Miracles. And in that book, Lewis is arguing that only supernaturalists can claim to know truth. Those who believe in the supernatural. It says only those kind of people can claim to know truth. He says that naturalism, anti-supernaturalism, is self-refuting because it provides absolutely no basis for epistemology. In other words, how can we know anything? That's epistemology. And we believe, theists believe, that we can have confidence that our perception of reality could be true because we were made in the image of God and in the imago Dei, and therefore, being created in the image of God, we've been created with a rational mind, if we'll use it. And so there's every reason to believe that God has conveyed truth in his written word, the Bible. Now, naturalists, of course, dispute all of that. I mean, we're just highly evolved animals, right? Highly evolved mammals. And as Charles Darwin even had admitted about a century before this time, if you are the product of evolution over millions of years, that means that your brain is a product of evolution as well. In other words, if you go back enough generations, your ancestors were nothing but monkeys. And as Darwin put it, how would you possibly trust that your thinking processes comport to reality? You wouldn't say that a monkey's brain, a monkey's thinking processes correspond to reality. So why do you think, that we can understand truth in an absolute sense? So anyway, that's the issue there. And Lewis is trying to make the case that if naturalism, atheism basically, is correct, there is no universe or value or value of truth outside of our own closed system. In other words, again, all that exists is just the product of naturalistic, materialistic forces. There is no supernatural being, and certainly no supernatural being who has conveyed truth through divine revelation. So if we're just a collection of atoms without souls, how can we trust that our minds can tell us anything truly about reality and truth? Okay, so that's the issue. Now, I'm not going to go into the details there, but Anscombe didn't buy that. Now, she wasn't an atheist. She was actually a committed Roman Catholic, and who took her Catholic faith very seriously. And but she's challenging this idea that Lewis puts forth. And she was a professional debater and very, very smart woman. And so she, in the opinion of those who attended the debate, she won the debate. And one reason for that, as she later wrote, is that the mere force of argument, in other words, trying to outsmart or overpower somebody intellectually, is never enough to convert another human being to Christianity, any more than acceptance of the creeds or some intellectual proposition is identical with real faith. The whole person, the whole imagination has to be consecrated. And again, it gets, we don't have time to go into the implications of all this. But anyway, a lot of people thought, well, boy, she really outclassed Lewis, in this debate. And however, for her part, Elizabeth Anscombe's part, she later said that she didn't think that she had dominated or won the debate at all. But in fact, the main thing that Lewis lost in this debate was faith not in the truth of the Christian apologetics or Christian arguments, but rather the ability of rational arguments to convince people who reject the very idea of absolute truth from realizing their error. So in other words, we use this emerging intellectual consensus after World War II. Oftentimes we refer to it as postmodernism, okay? And it's the idea, among other things, that there is no absolute truth, and everything is relative, everything is subjective, everything is a matter of opinion and point of view. And so the argument here is that just using intellectual arguments is not going to convince someone of the truth of the Christian faith. Now, however, that's not always the case. There are a lot of people who have come to faith in Jesus Christ by accepting the intellectual arguments of the Christian faith. But the point is true that it oftentimes requires more than just engaging the mind. And when you think about it, that was the case with C.S. Lewis's own conversion, if you think back to how he came to faith in Christ. Now, one commenter says that the modern rejection of natural law, remember these basic fundamental principles of right and wrong and reality and so on, the modern rejection of natural law, the axioms of which were once embedded in and transmitted through cultural and educational institutions throughout the Western world, would, in Lewis's opinion, create a generation of, quote, men without chests who reject reason and are enslaved to their own passions. Remember, he contrasted, people who are focused on their heart and those who are focused on their emotions, their stomach, basically. Men without chests who are driven by their passions, by their stomach, who reject reason and are enslaved to their passions. Now, ultimately, there would arise an elite class of social conditioners who shape those passions and thus enslave others at will. Political and moral freedom, according to Lewis, depended on natural law for a foundation. Now, when you think about it, the ultimate manifestation of this erosion of belief in natural law, that there are absolute moral, ethical values to which all of us are obliged to follow, the erosion of that would be what in modern history, if you think about the United States in particular, what forces eventually take over here in America that would lead to a great defection from the generic Christian principles of the past? Is there an era, a period in American history where you think things shift pretty dramatically? What?
Sexual.
Yeah, the 1960s. And there's a lot going on in the 60s, but what seems to be the primary driving force? Yeah, the sexual revolution. Yeah. And so, in fact, in 1960, the Upjohn Company unleashed on the American public the pill, okay, and the birth control pill. And that's oftentimes looked at as sort of the progenitor of what will become the sexual revolution of the 1960s. And then all the residual effects of that. For instance, a breakdown of traditional sexual standards. You can have sex now with anybody and everybody, you know, you want and all, and you're, quote, protected chemically. The increase in the illegitimate birth rate. I mean, it just absolutely skyrockets in the 1960s and has pretty much continued on since then, the illegitimate birth rate. Increase in single parent households. Legalization of abortion, of course, which will come at, you know, at the end of the 60s, early 70s. And eventually we're going to get, what, the LGBTQ revolution as well. So, and when you think about it, all this happened so quickly from 1960 to about 73. It wasn't at 73 when Supreme Court legalized, you know, abortion and so on. So just a dozen years or so. And we've been experiencing the results ever since. So again, any thoughts on any of that? And but this is basically what Lewis is trying to make the case for, and that is that yes, we need to understand that Christianity is all about the truth with a capital T, but very few people, frankly, I'm sure you've, you know, experienced this and noticed this yourself, very few people are primarily rational driven or reason based, you know, driven. It's mostly other factors, isn't it? You know, including passions and desires and so on. And we see the consequences of all that, especially in terms of sexual ethics over the last, well, since the early 60s. Any thoughts? Yes, Don. Yeah, yeah.
Doesn't matter anymore. You can have a perfectly logical discussion with someone and they'll go, oh, sure, but I don't believe that, or that's not my truth. I mean, they really literally say, I don't care. That's not what I think.
That's right. I just prefer not to believe that, you know. And oftentimes, if you try to share your faith with somebody who's at that stage, they'll pat you on the head and tell you, well, that's nice. I'm glad, you know, I'm glad you believe in Jesus and all that. But, you know, I don't. And, you know, we're still both equal, you know. So that's kind of the mentality, isn't it? And that's the mentality that naturally occurs when we jettison the idea that there is absolute universal truth and everything is reduced to a matter of subjective feelings and preferences and so on. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Yes, Bruce?
did really touch on the fact that, I mean, a lot of people, someone at the time and thereafter, used this as an example to beat Lewis around the head and shoulders, that he had been so thoroughly discouraged by this event, this loss to Danska,
Oh,
that he withdrew from philosophy and apologetics altogether
yeah,
and turned to children's literature. Like Narnia.
yeah.
Mathematics, he always had a love for those sorts of things.
Mhm.
And even A.N. Wilson, who we had some very nice quotes about Lewis at the beginning, was one of the people, and George Sayer, who
Yeah.
promulgated that issue of
Yeah.
this devastating event that happened
Yeah.
to Lewis.
Yeah, and yet Elizabeth Anscombe herself says, well, you know, I didn't dominate the
He
debate.
says, my own recollection is that it was an occasion of sober discussion and certain quite definite criticisms, which Lewis's rethinking and rewriting showed he thought were accurate. I'm inclined to construe the odd accounts of the matter by some of his friends, quote unquote, who seem not to have been interested in the actual arguments of the subject matter, as an interesting example of the phenomenon called projection.
Yeah,
That was her.
yeah, 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 yeah. So, anyway, yeah, there is this myth, as you mentioned, which some of his biographers, like A.N. Wilson, would perpetrate, and that, or perpetuate, and that is that Lewis was so humiliated, especially being defeated by a woman. And so he retreats into children's literature. But that's been, I think, very effectively debunked.
He was not known as someone with successful relationship.
I'm sorry?
He was not known as someone with a long string of successful relationships.
That's, yes, yes, to say the least. All right, so you see the low point there. And what I'm referring to in that regard, in that short little section, is by the end of the 1940s, Lewis has reached kind of a low point in his life. He's turning 50 years old, and his best days, he thinks, are behind him. And also, there are those who say also his status as a Christian apologist had been damaged. But again, that's quite questionable. But Mrs. Moore, remember her? She's in declining health. She has a serious problem with varicose veins, and she grows more irritable and more demanding all the time, which is quite a high standard, by the way. And as a result, Lewis spends almost every spare moment attending to her needs. He writes to a friend that he felt like a man in chains. Now, all of this, including Mrs. Moore's health condition, the fact that she's becoming more and more demanding all the time, really irritates Warney. He never liked her in the first place. And it does bring out an interesting aside, and that is that for his part, Warney, who you remember had a serious alcohol problem, he couldn't even serve in World War II in the British military because of it. Warney avoids helping out around the house, just as he avoids getting serious help for his alcohol addiction. George Sayer, one of Lewis's biographers, says Warney liked to think that he was living the life of a gentleman. Warney was also a deceptive drinker, and like many alcoholics, was able to appear sober even when he was not. The resident handyman for Lewis in their household, a man named Paxford, commented years later, Mr. Jack worked himself to the bone, talking about C.S. Lewis, but the major, Warney, hardly ever did a thing. He didn't like work. So the burden is strictly on C.S. Lewis in that case. All right, now if we turn the page here, we come to the creator of Narnia. Now I'm going to handle this very, very quickly. Although I realize that for many people, their introduction to C.S. Lewis came through the Chronicles of Narnia and so on, and for many it's maybe it may be their favorite works that Lewis ever wrote. And then there's others who just don't pay that much attention to it and focus on the apologetics and so on. But just as briefly as I can be, Lewis began writing the first in that series, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, in 1939. But then, of course, the war breaks out. And so that idea gestates for a decade before he finally finishes it in 1949. The series was inspired in part by children who had stayed in his home during the war, during the Blitz. And Lewis begins to imagine a children's fantasy in which these children heroically face great moral challenges that shape their characters and their souls. In fact, the fact that he was drawn to write children's literature was curious, given the fact that he never much cared for children. And they were always, you know, kind of in the way, by the way. You have to watch where you walk, you know, when they're in the house. And he also didn't care much for children's literature either. He did, though, have an active and vivid imagination, as you know. And he had his own philosophy of what constituted quality literature, both for adults and for children as well. And so what ultimately mattered, according to Lewis, was that a good story must have a transcendent ethical quality that inspires the reader. He's absolutely right, I think, about that. I mean, what's the point in just writing entertainment? Okay. So it needs to have a transcendent ethical quality. And that's what he's trying to do in the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the Chronicles of Narnia. Now, according to Lewis, his aim was to inculcate in the minds of children a basic moral framework that would make it easier for them to accept Christianity when they encountered Christianity later in life. He put it this way: I am aiming at a sort of pre-baptism of the child's imagination. Okay. And how do you do that? Well, you introduce a story that has great moral truths and great spiritual truths. And it may be, you know, fantasy, but nonetheless, the truths prevail. One author has written, Lewis's stories serve to enhance moral education, to build character. And again, there's nothing wrong with just entertainment, of course, but generally speaking, I think we should aspire to something that's, you know, not only entertaining, but again, morally, you know, developing as well. One of Lewis's student followers who later became very prominent in India, he moved to India and started an ashram, a Christian ashram in India. His name's Bede Griffiths. Griffiths wrote years later, the figure of Aslan, the lion, obviously, tells us more of how Lewis understood the nature of God than anything else he wrote. It has all the hidden power and majesty and awesomeness which Lewis associated with God, but also all the glory and the tenderness and even the humor which he believed belonged to him, belonged to God, so that children could run up to him and throw their arms around him and kiss him. And, you know, if you're familiar with the Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, you know that that's the case. You know, you got this great roaring lion, but he's also very tender and loving and so on. George Sayer, again, a biographer, writes, no wonder that my little stepdaughter, after she had read all the Narnia stories, cried bitterly and said, I don't want to go on living in this world. I want to live in Narnia with Aslan. That's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the best commentaries on all of that I've ever come across. Again, there's so much more that could be said, but for time's sake, I think we probably ought to move on. Any other comments, though? Yes, Karen? Oh, Karen, a little louder.
Someone next year is planning on making the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie. Yeah, they're talking about making Meryl Streep as them.
Oh,
And a man's gonna be the White Witch.
Oh, I didn't hear that.
oh,
Whoa. Yeah, right.
Well, those are definitely Hollywood values. I'm sorry, you were saying. Yeah, we can pray that's the case. Yeah. Yeah.
Minds think alike.
Yeah.
But to take something so beautiful and to destroy it, it's just maddening.
That's Hollywood.
Yeah, yeah, it really is very, very sad. Well, hopefully it'll generate so much criticism that, most people won't care about it. All right, well, let's move on to page 33 here. Lewis and Tolkien, The Great Falling Out. Now, remember that Lewis had been a great influence on Tolkien's writings, encouraging him to persevere in writing, this great epic, The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and so on. Unfortunately, though, Tolkien couldn't find it within himself to reciprocate. He read snippets of Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and he concluded that this was really second-rate stuff. Okay, he's comparing it with his own masterpiece, The Lord of the Rings, and in particular, he objects to what he calls mythological syncretism. In other words, there's no cohesive unity in this odd menagerie of very disparate, very anachronistic characters and images that show up in the Chronicles of Narnia. When you read The Lord of the Rings, you see it as first-rate mythology, and most everything that occurs, you could almost imagine this happened thousands and thousands of years ago, But with Lewis, you get a very, very odd mix of characters and images and so on, a hodgepodge of images, including fauns, minotaurs, dwarfs, cyclops, you have talking beavers, Father Christmas even shows up. And Tolkien's thinking, this is just weird, okay? I know plenty of people who've felt the same way. So Narnia seemed to lack mythological and historical depth. So I think that's true for some people. They read it and this is okay. Well, it'd be good for children, but that's about as far as it goes. And then other people do find it to be very, I guess, fulfilling to some extent or another. But anyway, Lewis was very disappointed and very offended by Tolkien's criticisms. And so this was a major factor in their friendship eroding as well. And but what really ended their friendship pretty much was once Lewis got involved with Joy Davidman Gresham, someone whom a lot of his friends could not tolerate one bit. And so that's more of a topic for next week. But again, any thoughts on that? What do you think about Tolkien's criticisms of the Chronicles of Narnia?
Like his stuff. His stuff was way out there too.
Well,
No,
but
way out there. I remember reading it as a kid, I'm like, okay, it's got different.
well, it's clearly mythology,
mythology.
but doesn't it kind of sound like classical mythology?
I don't
You know.
like it was just I don't know, jealousy. I mean, why? I don't know.
Well,
Sometimes it would, yeah. But that what led him to go to Cambridge was eventually after his experience at Oxford, or was it just?
Well, this was not a major factor in Lewis leaving Oxford and going to Cambridge, but it is a factor in Lewis's friendships with perhaps one of his closest friends, J.R.R. Tolkien, that declined considerably after Lewis had been so encouraging of Tolkien's works. And then Lewis starts writing this fantasy not a series, and Tolkien looks at it as frankly second rate. Yes.
I disagree because who cares about what he just said? I think he gets across beautifully the whole point of what he's trying to get across, you know,
Mhm,
the sacrifice of Christ
mhm,
as shown as Advent.
mhm.
And it has spoken, I think, to so many children and even adults. I think, I love it. So I think it's,
Mhm.
I do not agree with.
Mhm.
Oh, I mean, maybe that is true, I don't know, but again, who cares?
Well, I can say that I'm very much looking forward to sitting in on your conversation with Tolkien in heaven and give him, quote, a piece of your mind, okay? Okay.
See how, I mean, you've seen how popular it is. I mean,
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I think it's
And-
wonderful.
And I think most anybody would say there's there's value in it. The moral truth, spiritual truths that are conveyed and all, but Tolkien's comparing it with his own
Yeah.
great work, see, and he finds it to be just, well, I think we would call it these days kind of pop fantasy, you know, it would be his opinion.
So I just real quick, I never thought that, but I could see the difference. I mean, Lord of the Rings is a consistent
Yeah.
time frame and
Yeah.
characters and it's sequential and you're
Mhm,
not jumping in and out of different worlds
mhm.
I mean, it does have different, there are some animals, but anyway, I can see the argument, but
just
also
different.
it's appealing to a different audience perhaps.
Yeah,
because
yeah, I think
not
that's
getting
probably
really
true.
lots of- The children, I'm not sure if Tolkien that was his primary audience. 'Cause it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I have to say-
Good point. Yes.
I love the Chronicles of Narnia, but I always did feel like when Father Christmas shows up.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Um, yeah, other thoughts? Yeah, oh, please.
Just, I've read them all, 89 times. But they're two completely different sets of books. The Lord of the Rings is deep and rich and
Mhm.
and very realistic.
Hmm.
The Chronicles of Narnia is very much a dream. It's a fantasy,
Mhm.
it's dreamlike, and that's
Mhm.
why it's not unusual to see all these weird things coming around because weird things
Mhm.
happen in dreams. And it's very much like a dream, but they're both there's a lot to be said for both of them.
Yeah. Good observation. Yes.
I mean, the audience, the two works were intended for entirely different.
Seems like it,
I
doesn't
mean,
it?
you try to write something accessible to children. Although lots of adults have found it very interesting as well. But and Tolkien certainly was not aimed at children. This is scary.
Yeah, like what age would a child really get into the Lord of the Rings, would you think? Oh, really? That old? Really? Yeah.
Younger people.
Mhm. But not young children, probably.
Not fifth
Mhm.
grade.
Mhm.
Well, I don't. I would think, no, I mean, Lord of the Rings, no.
Yeah, right.
Mhm.
Elementary school, Narnia. I
Oh,
think,
yeah.
For sure,
Mhm.
but not more,
Mhm. Okay.
in my
All
opinion.
right. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for your insights on that.
So what does she mean that their relationship was really
Yeah.
over this? I mean, it seems really trivial to look back. Because they had a deep friendship.
Well, they did, but maybe Reed would have some insight here. Oftentimes, songwriters, composers, and all. Of course, there's always the element of competition, but they oftentimes can be hypercritical of their quote competitors or Any comment, any thoughts on that?
Have it ever-
Pardon me? Yeah,
so
Yeah.
Your goal was to find out his opinion.
yeah, yeah. Well, think of Lennon and McCartney and see back when they started, bands had one singer, okay? But here's two guys who were talented songwriters and also really good singers. And so there's this competition, and it worked for a few years in terms of them motivating one another, but eventually it becomes rather hostile. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on then to joy and grief. Okay. Now, one night in April of 1950, Mrs. Moore fell out of bed and was taken by an ambulance to a nursing home there in Oxford. And Lewis, we're told, over the next several months, visits her very, very faithfully, spends a tremendous amount of time by her bedside and all. Now, according to Warney, Mrs. Moore also became increasingly senile, but that's Warney's view, and he never liked her in the first place. She finally dies of influenza in January of 1951, and this is Warney's reaction. He'd always resented the way she controlled his brother, and he noted in his journal, quote, "And so ends the mysterious self-imposed slavery in which Jack," calls him Jay, but he's talking about Jack, his brother, "has lived for the past 30 years. And according again to one of Lewis's biographers, George Sayer, Warney actually celebrated her passing by drinking just enough to make it impossible for him to go to the funeral. That Warney, he's a smart guy. So he drinks just enough to get a plausible excuse for not showing up at her funeral. Okay. But anyway, her passing really opens up a new phase in Lewis's life. And for the first time in decades, he's free to develop new relationships and to travel and that sort of thing. Now, in 1955, he'll write his semi-autobiography, Surprised by Joy. I mean, it's not a true autobiography in the classical sense. It's really just vignettes and commentaries on certain aspects in his life. He doesn't try to cover his life in any systematic way. But some have called it just musings on his life. But it is a great, great read. And Lewis readily admitted that the book was not a conventional autobiography. Essentially, it was a mental exercise to help him think through the major patterns and influences in his life. But how many of you have read Surprised by Joy? Okay, I would highly recommend it. I mean, it is really great, has some great insights. Lewis put it this way: this book is written partly to answer, in answer to requests that I would tell how I passed from atheism to Christianity. The book aims at telling the story of my conversion and is not a general autobiography. And that's certainly the case. But yeah, I would encourage you sometime to read that. It's, I think, one of the most inspiring works you'll ever read. All right, now the Cambridge connection. Despite the fact that despite the fact that he's of his notoriety and so on, Lewis was not, as I said earlier, particularly popular with his colleagues there at Oxford. In 1947, he's featured on the cover of Time magazine. Let's see, I think I featured, yeah, there's the cover on the back of your study guide. And
They didn't like that.
oh no, not at all. In fact, many of them stopped subscribing to Time magazine, I would imagine. But this is what, and I don't recall the name of the author of that long article on Lewis in Time, but this is what he wrote. Lewis is one of a growing band of heretics among modern intellectuals, a heretic among modern intellectuals. He's an intellectual who actually believes in God. Wow, fancy that. And who accepts all the articles of the Christian faith. Lewis is scornful of many modern intellectual and moral fashions, as he should be, obviously. He goes on to say, Lewis is a bitter academic opponent of Oxford's, quote, progressive element of scientists and faculty members who would lay more stress on, quote, useful courses than on Oxford's traditional concern with the humanities. I mean, Lewis is not into science and math and that sort of thing. It's all about the humanities for him, what we sometimes call the social sciences and all. Outside of his own Christian circle, Lewis is not particularly popular with his Oxford colleagues. Some resent his large student following. Others criticize his, quote, cheap performances on the BBC when he was doing these radio broadcasts and sneer at him as a, quote, popularizer. There are complaints about his rudeness. He's inclined to bellow nonsense in the heat of an argument. But their most serious charge is that Lewis's theological pamphleteering is a kind of academic heresy. So the point there being that, you know, academics are above all this. They're above religion and, you know, that sort of thing. And they should, if they have any religious beliefs, they should keep it to themselves. In the early 1950s, he's passed over for academic promotions 2 or 3 times. And there seem to be 3 problems among his colleagues as to why he's denied these academic promotions. One would be they criticize him for producing too much work that was popular rather than scholarly. Okay. You know, most of the scholarly works, of course, hardly anybody ever reads, except maybe your colleagues when you go to the, you know, Georgia or the American Historical Society. You wouldn't believe some of the presentations of people reading their latest research on some obscure topic that nobody who has a life could possibly be interested in. I've sat through many of those. Secondly, many colleagues were jealous of his success and his notoriety. Thirdly, many colleagues were hostile. They were even embarrassed due to his open identification with traditional Christian orthodoxy. On one occasion, Lewis remarked, "I confess I'm astonished at the virulence of the anti-Christian feeling shown here at Oxford." In other words, yeah, I know most of these people are not Christians, but they're hateful toward Christianity. In 1955, then, he leaves Magdalen College in Oxford to accept a professorship in medieval and Renaissance literature at Magdalen College in Cambridge. Both universities have a Magdalen College, you know, named in honor of Mary Magdalene, you know. So as Americans, we'd read that and think it's Magdalen College. And the British, we know have always had a problem with the English language. And so they pronounced this Magdalen College. Now, Lewis felt respected and appreciated at Cambridge, and there was more of a collegial atmosphere there than at Oxford as well. And now we come to, oh no, Joy David. Okay. So I'm going to go as far as I can so as we have 15 minutes left. I'd like to go as far into this as possible so that we'll have a little more time in our final session in a couple of weeks. All right, so Lewis is, of course, a great hero to many Christians and many spiritual seekers. And he's regularly deluged with letters and requests. And it's remarkable. He would write personal handwritten responses to thousands of cards and letters that came in every year. Now, there was a certain point at which he was so deluged that he began dictating responses, and Warney, who had nothing else to do anyway, would write the responses. But ever since the publication of the Screwtape Letters back in the early 1940s, Lewis had been attracting a lot of American readers. And then in September of 1946, in that there was an issue of the Atlantic magazine, of all things, in which the author published an article entitled C.S. Lewis, Apostle to the Skeptics. And among those who read that article was Joy Davidman Gresham. And Joy was so impressed by that article in the Atlantic that she picked up The Great Divorce and read it, and then she picked up the Screwtape Letters and read that as well. And in the process, she says that she became a Christian. And in 1950, she begins corresponding or writing to Lewis. Now, she's a very gifted writer, and he's undoubtedly very impressed by her intellect and so on. She had a very colorful background, colorful, mostly red, however, as she was a communist earlier in her life. Her parents were secular Jews. They'd immigrated to New York City from Eastern Europe. Her father was a Fabian socialist, in other words, well, basically the Socialist Party in England, referred to as Fabianism or Fabianism. And following the stock market crash of 1929, Joy became an atheist and a communist. I hope that's not happening currently, that the problems in the stock market are, we're going to have a great revival of atheism in America or something. But as she later recounted in her autobiographical essay called The Longest Way Round, this she published in 1951, quote, "In 1929, I believed in nothing but American prosperity. In 1930, I believed in nothing, period. Men, I said, are only apes. Virtue is only a custom. Life is only an electrochemical reaction. Mind is only a set of conditioned reflexes. And anyway, most people aren't rational like me. Love, art, and altruism are only sex. The universe is only matter. Matter is only energy." And I forgot what I said energy was. So, you know, kind of clever and all. And you can tell, I mean, she's, you know, quite intellectually gifted and so on. And she's a child prodigy. Supposedly she has an IQ of 150 plus. She exhibits exceptional analytical, critical, musical skills. She graduated from Hunter College in New York in 1934. Now, she would have been under 20, the age of 20, and she earns an MA in English literature at Columbia University, you know, an Ivy League institution, at the age of 20. She gets an MA at age 20. She teaches English in high school before becoming a film critic and poetry editor for a communist newspaper called The New Masses. In 1938, she publishes a book on poetry called Letters to a Comrade, which won a prize at Yale University for its poetry. She also worked for a time in Hollywood as a scriptwriter for MGM. So again, I mean, obviously a very gifted person intellectually and so on. In 1942, she met her future husband, William Gresham, and they met at a Communist Party meeting. They're two peas in a pod, apparently, at that time. Now, her husband, Bill, was an atheist. He was a newspaper reviewer, a former nightclub singer. He's also an alcoholic and a habitual womanizer. In the late 1930s, he had joined the Abraham Lincoln Brigade and fought for the communists in Spain against the fascists. Okay. You had several thousand Americans who were hardcore leftists who, in the late 30s, during the Spanish Civil War, they signed up for what was called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, misnamed that, and they went over to Spain to help fight for the communist side against the Nazis, the fascist side. Now, she and her husband had two children. One was David, born in 1944, and one was Douglas, born in 1945. Now, Douglas still professes to be a Christian. I've seen him a time or two. And so he's sort of somebody who carries on the C.S. Lewis tradition. But anyway, Joy is a very proud atheist. And she's a moral relativist, of course, and a hedonist with a cynical view of life. And according to her, her conversion to Christianity comes very abruptly in the midst of a crisis. In 1947, Bill abruptly left her and her sons, which left her absolutely stunned. So as she later wrote in her autobiography, quote, "God had been stalking me for a long time, waiting for this moment. He crept nearer so silently that I never knew he was there. Then all at once, he sprang. For the first time in my life, I felt helpless. For the first time, my pride was forced to admit that I was not, after all, the master of my own fate. All my defenses, the walls of arrogance and cocksuredness and self-love, behind which I had hid from God, went down momentarily. And at that point, God came in. Since childhood, I had been pouring half my energy into the task of keeping God out. When it was over, I found myself on my knees praying. I think I must have been the world's most astonished atheist." This is real interesting because we all, love people in our family and other people as well who are close friends. And, in our limited grasp of reality, we never, I guess we never pray that they'll encounter terrible adversity and pain and suffering in their lives. But look, we know from so many examples that's what it takes to break down one's ego resistance, that wall of resistance. When everything's going well, you think you're on the top of the world, you're thriving in your vocation and so on. And then all of that collapses, or you suffer a divorce or something like that. And all of that evaporates, and you realize you're just alone in the universe, and your only hope for salvation is total submission to God. We talk a lot about this in our course on theodicy. If God is great and God is good, why is there so much suffering and pain and evil in the world? We devote an entire course to that. But you can see here just one example of how God breaks through her arrogance, her ego, and so on. And she almost involuntarily opens her heart to God. That's the only thing she can turn to. Well, theodicy is this how would I call it? This great dilemma that, as Christians, we believe that God is omnipotent and he's the source of all goodness. And yet there's so much, and by the way, he created humanity, and yet there's so much evil and suffering and pain and all. And how do you reconcile that, say? So that's, in theology, that's referred to as theodicy issue. So she believes that God appeared to her at that point, and when the vision ended, she found herself down on her knees in prayer. I mean, I'm sure she was absolutely shocked. Now, Bill, her husband, eventually came home, and after Joy shared her experience with him, he declared, supposedly, his faith in God too. And they began attending church together. And for the next 3 years, Bill stopped drinking and going out with other women and so on. Unfortunately, that didn't last long, however. Okay. So interesting backstory to what we'll talk about in a lot more detail 2 weeks from now in our final session. Okay. And you see the next section there, inspired by Joy and Lewis's relationship with her. It's a fascinating story. And then we'll try to cover as much as possible the remaining topics there in the study guide. Any comments or questions or disputations or anything? A lot to ponder.
Her initial tape for women.
That's the understatement of the evening. Yes. What's that? Oh, yeah. But again, the reality that oftentimes we have to be totally broken, don't we? To surrender to the Lord. And we don't wish misery on anybody, obviously.
God has to do it to you.
Especially what?
Especially when God has to do it to you, not you,
Yeah.
to get your attention.
Yeah.
You never want that to happen. Sometimes.
Yeah.
you gotta know it.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, how many people have turned their lives to Christ because of abject failure in their life? Everything that they were striving for has collapsed. And yet it's a manifestation of divine grace, isn't it?
It is, I think. And
Yeah.
I think that's what grace is all about.
Uh-huh.
Then you realize that's the only place you should have gone. So
Mhm.
I just once with prayer, just because sometimes the last thing we do is the first thing we should do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then you're like, oh yeah, I should have,
Right.
should have, could have, whatever, still.
Yeah.
And then you
Might
look
have.
back on it like, wow, he was so patient and graceful with me.
Yes.
You never want to wish that on another person.
Yeah, and he preserves our life,
Yeah,
up to that point
a lot
as
of
well.
times, you look back and be like, wow, God is grace would be big. That's why you would never wish it on someone else.
Right.
Come on.
Right. Well, any other thoughts anyone has? Here's a comment in the chat, and excuse me, where did it go? Oh, this is from Janet, Janet Verba, and some of you know Janet. Janet is a longtime friend. In fact, when we first started Areopagus classes, we were doing them at Cumberland Community Church over near Cumberland Mall. And Janet was very much involved from the very outset. And now she is a teacher at Osborne High School here in Cobb County. Janet writes that, quote, that is what drove me to seek God. Janet, would you mind just taking a brief moment to amplify what you mean there?
If people don't know my story, I did not grow up knowing God. My parents never spoke about God. And once I left home, I was an all-star athlete, and God just took my running away from me. took my physical health away. And it's what led me to ask those existential questions like, what is life about? Is there more to life than this? Is there a God? And after 6 years of seeking, he took me to my ancestral country, the Czech Republic, where I became a born again believer. So yeah, it's now I've been walking with him for 30 years.
Yeah.
But it took absolute, like I was suicidally depressed at that time. And he wouldn't allow me to do anything that was my norm where I could escape. So
No exit, huh?
no exit, no running, no help. He goes,
Mhm.
I'm not touch that. But it brought me to him. So I'm very thankful for that.
Well, those of us who know you are very thankful for you. And Janet lived in uh, Northern California, just outside of San Francisco, for about 10 years
Mm-hmm.
until about 10 years ago or something like that when she moved back
Yep.
to Georgia. And Dolly and I went out and stayed with her a couple of days once, and we had just the most delightful time touring San Francisco and Berkeley and places like that. And then late in the afternoon, we thought, okay, what are we going to do now tonight? Well, maybe the Giants are playing. So we checked, and yeah, there was a Giants game going on that evening. And so we went, and it was nearly a sellout, but we managed to come up with great seats.
Awesome.
And yeah, and we watched a perfect game. Now, if you know anything about baseball, Major League Baseball, there's only been 22 perfect games in history. And so that was probably the greatest blessing of my life. No, wait. That's probably going a little too far.
But it was really awesome. We
It,
just
it
went
was.
spontaneously
It's pretty
and look what God did for us. And
Yeah.
it's one of the most awesome baseball stadiums to be in
Oh,
as a
it-
spectator or player, because
So
half of it is over water.
yeah. Matt Cain of the Giants. Yeah, and it was oh. Yeah, let me tell you about it in detail here. Uh, I happen to have it here in my pocket. Yes. No, good. Thank you, Janet, for sharing that, and good being with you all. And
Yeah.
those of you joining us online, have a blessed week as we prepare for Resurrection Sunday coming up, and may it be one of the most meaningful Resurrection Sundays you've ever experienced. And so let's just pray that God uses us in every way possible to influence as many people for Him as possible. So, all right. Well, blessings. Good being with you. Have a wonderful rest of the week and a great week next week as well. So we'll meet for our final session, not next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. All
So
right.
is there no meeting next Wednesday?
No meeting during Holy Week. Right. Okay. Thank you. Good being with you all. Bye-bye.
Y'all. Bye.